The high treason against the United States by Lindsey Graham and other Confederates' declaration of war against the civilian population for the spoiling of their people and the engagement, the distribution of profits for these fraudulent schemes in order to digest the profits in the monopolistic arrangements of the white supremacist communism, centralizes all of the power and the status, offer the fraudulent claim that it's not about race, it's about status when they have controlled it on the basis of race through their communism, and thus predetermined the outcomes, and thus predetermined on the basis of race the arrangements, in calculating the opposition to the white supremacists by those loyal to the United States in their assumption, generates the curtailed positions of the low socioeconomic peasants that are the Confederate white supremacist communists, who, not being competent enough to succeed naturally, engage in violence and nonviolent contests, such as their rape culture and its undermining of the free market's arrangements of those who would have engaged in particular practices, and thus those who have purchased the permits have engaged in the automation by phantom cells for the terrorism to final predetermined outcomes, including the strawman arguments by the filters enforced by the white supremacist phantom cells to engage in those actions which would socially be unacceptable for those participants, who then are viewed as defective culturally, and thus reinforce the bigot's position on how to treat them from the strawman argument through their filter. Thus, the arrangement of the social engineering and other hate crimes actively manipulates these positions, normalizing the terrorist operations and the distribution of its black market and its various estimates on the assumption of value of each particular exchange traded as the criminal advantage, and the normalization of this is funding by, of, and for rape for as a foundational resource of the other materials, and the function of the other materials being based on the foundation of these rape permits, destabilizing the various communities, such as uh, those the white supremacists targeted, in order to destabilize them, creating cultural defects in these arrangements, normalize the position of them not being physically inept but culturally inept, which is socially engineered by their abusers, and their acceptance of their abuse culture automates their suppression and thus this destruction of their own society by the genocide arrangements, which would have been undermined by the existence of David, which they had already estimated long before his father was born, generating the legend of David functions, such as the zombie insurance, which would have protected against these undermined positions, as the intelligence oversight would have been able to have beaten them in the various proxies, as their wizard arrangements for the studies in their schools of high class elite schooling for the wizards are the distribution of the frauds of their religion and the mechanism of their gods of light, which generates the fraud, creating God of the Bible as the demiurge, is actively maintained the contempt for the function of doing things correctly in favor of the distribution of fraud, and those functions of the distribution of fraud generates the status quo function of their actual functioning competence, compared to an actual education where being sane is a relevant aspect. Instead of toying with people, the function of earning your place in society and being able to sustain yourself in that generates the masculine competitions and the forming of the hierarchy on the foundation of competence, as opposed to their undermining function where your ability to defeat them as a wizard in the function changes the subject from the contest into the function of who is a better cheater, and the function of these arrangements actively engage in the traps and subversions, such as the undermining of the various treaties, which is the foundation of David's original projected sexuality, generating the position of their jealousy. And as much superior David is in their own minds to themselves, is the quantity of the retaliation, which sets a market price value on the difference between them, and thus those who wish a more strategic function would extort those of lower sexual value being promoted to engage in those retaliations for the suppression, acquiring greater and greater suppressions, and the function of the greater suppression qualifies their exchange as wizards, qualifying their status on the basis of their undermining abuses, as the low value version of them are the bullies from high school type of propaganda, which has normalized as a cultural function uh, throughout the ages inside the United States and West and everywhere else, actually. But that exponentially increased as their core identity being invested into exponentially expands their various frauds and abuses in order to engage in the function of capturing the resource, and the function of having captured the various resources normalizes the foundation of rape as the society. Thus, their ability to trap and undermine and social engineer and redirect the cattle that is women generates the outcome that they don't actually have competent alternatives except to the rape permit, which is their only sexual market value validation, which then discounts them as low value, as the value of acquiring them is traded on a different mechanism, and thus they themselves as a value can be substantively ignored, which the female narcissist exponentially exploits for their advantage. Um, as female narcissists, their foundational quality requires the existence of extorting the product in favor of the power. Engaging in these functions, they cannot sustain themselves without the existence of rape by which to pretend to complain about, which they are guilty of, and thus the various descriptions of the distractions generating the cover story for their witchcraft engaging in the various abuses normalizes the compounding interest of the fraud against the courts when they exchange with each other. And the fundamental essence of their quality means no one who is actually competent could trust anyone else in their culture, which is often ignored, which is the foundational quality of their capability of being captured as a unit, which generates the natural inclination towards inbreeding as the function of their superiority requires the purity of their blood, which is normal to Confederate racism. At which point, this function exponentially compounds on itself, and thus it becomes the normal standard in an unavoidable way, as the existence of their fraud creates the spells which cannot be escaped in those puzzles and traps, and the only actual exit from the system is to support the rule of law of the United States against their culture. So if they generate a reality TV distraction, their ability to fall for the distraction of an abused person who is a disguised value generates their disdain and coercion against the association with the coerced person, which generates their self-pruning of their sexual options into the rapists. At which point, those who are of a higher intelligence, being able to see through the abuse as a retaliation of an inferior, would systemically ignore the visible side effects of the illusion in favor of the core value that they would be pursuing, which is normally not going to be the case. The majority of even sane women are systemically going to actively go after the obvious value of those who are secure, and the function of them being secure makes them viable options, and thus they actively pursue more predatory, abusive people in order to engage in the protection. And thus, those who are rapists would be the ones acquiring all of the women on the basis of these compounding values of the communist sexual market, generating the predetermined outcomes which they systemically complain about legitimately, as they are primarily a low value subject to domestic abuse by those who do not consider them a core value to be interested in. And thus, their satisfaction, being a low quality, generates the natural position of the self reinforced prophecy, at which point these positions are actively put against the superior value in the original market, which generates the retaliation of the inferior sexual options, and thus the self-feeding cycle generates their retaliation. And these estimates, um, founding themselves on the higher value of the American patriarchy and aristocracy, etc., generates the position of systemically attacking the higher value with higher abuse, and thus the more important they are, the more abused they become, certifying their exchanges on their crime market for their status and revenue according to the wizard revenue system, generating on the basis of their ability to manufacture normalized crimes, which has normalized pedophilia, such as through J. Sekulow Civil War, which has criminalized the evidence of their engagements, at which point anyone who finds them can't really get a conviction without proof, and they can't get proof without being convicted, and the act of convicting them allows them to discard and destroy and subvert and undermine the process of the American system, which is not going to be able to have a remedy to a secret, and thus the infection of the parasite, blocking a remedy to a secret, protects Confederate magic spells, reinforcing the permanent state of systemic racism and its rape culture, generating the natural retaliations for this value, at which point the protection of women requires the force of the duel, which will compel Congress to acknowledge David as intelligence oversight at the highest level for his position as the top ranked general, in order to engage in the dismantlement of the wizard communists and their various Confederate militias, generating the destruction of these catastrophic threats to history. And thus, the original projected value of these criminal intentions written down on their crime market has to be acknowledged for these functions, which generates the natural outcomes for their ability to maintain their fraud. They have to be able to internally recognize the crimes in order to verify that the thing happened, in order to verify that the spell worked, in order to estimate the potency of each status when they actively maintain themselves as a pseudo credit score, but for crime. And thus, um, all currency is based upon debts to society on their exchange. And this breeds into the subjugation and feudalist arrangements of capturing other nations, such as the nations under NATO and Israel and others who would have had their treaties with David, who are coerced and threatened to side with the confederacies, abusing David, or they would be retaliated against by Lindsey Graham and other traitors to the country, at which point they are all intimidated into place against their own interest, and thus they are engaged in a functional catch-22, where complying gets them into a suicide bombing arrangement, and not complying gets them attacked, and thus they would have to collectively unify themselves against the criminal retaliation of the inbred insurgency, um, in order to survive its literally their only option. They would have to support David to maturity through the duel, and the Americans would have to be able to competently put down the insurrection aggressively. And this is their only actual hope of survival. Otherwise, they're in a predetermined death cycle where only the Nazis get to kill them. At which point they actively have the protection of the United States, which being compromised by the Confederacy, which created the Nazis, actively maintained the ingestion through Project Paperclip and Overcast and others, which generated the position of normalizing the Nazi faction of the Confederacy, and thus the compulsion of those nations, such as Israel, to be subject to Nazism in the insurance fraud scheme from the abuses historically generates their position of their subordination, stating that only the Nazis get to kill them, and thus they are protected until they are murdered, which is no win at all. And this arrangement can only be replaced by the existence of the United States supporting David in the duel and brutally exterminating the insurrection. And this being fundamentally understood is the foundation of the contract schedule in the abuses against David as a retaliation against the original value of the contract schedule from the American point of view, which escalates David from foundation to country, and that nation, that kingdom, that constitutional kingdom, actively engaged in the brokering throughout nations, would actively maintain the function of being able to maintain their peace without the threat of the fraud, which would make David exponentially powerful and wealthy, generating their attractive state to acquiring favorable agreements with him, which would actively maintain their position of promoting women for the treaties, which David cannot refuse sexual options for, which generates the status quo function, and normal cultural functions would be exponentially compounded on these arrangements, taking up large portions of David's schedule in order to engage in the function of maintaining his health and its relations with the nations of the world, his peers. As in the court of law saying that you cannot be convicted under due process without the function of a jury of your peers. That group of peers are other world nations. The other world leaders of those countries are the only ones that could be considered his peers or equals, competent enable competent in the ability to speak with him as equals to be respected on mutual ground, such as their international arrangements and negotiations and settlements, which would exponentially be supported by David's faculties from the equipment in his brokerage for these arrangements, which would have automated their own accounts, which would generate an open market where they would spend the majority of their negotiations with David not speaking with David, but internally looking over all of the information and the data sent to them in the reports specific to their accounts on the basis of their various statuses and values and interests, which they would have been negotiating, normalizing the original order of the international arrangements, which includes the insurance of the former Soviet Union, which would have protected it against the collapse negative effects. And while the former Soviet Union would collapse, it would not have to suffer nearly as much. And the arrangement of having removed the white supremacists by a competent American military in the original estimate uh, would have, if that would have happened, then by definition, the insurance would have gone through and it would have protected them from the tragic catastrophe of the enforced poverty by the racists. Now, with that as a foundational quality, the conflict in Israel with its neighbors is founded on that manipulation where it has been strong-armed and subordinated to the Confederacy, and thus it can't not do its thing, and thus if an Israel didn't exist, they would have to make one in order to maintain their interests around the world, and thus the Muslim argument that Israel is the lesser evil. And what was the quote? America is the greater Satan, and Israel is the lesser Satan, which actively maintains the function of the enforcement of the wizard communism against the other countries in the Middle East, which would have actively maintained the prospecting of conflicts with them picking fights unnecessarily and extorting various arrangements underneath the orders of the Confederates, which generates Israel in its position of not being able to do much about the issue, and thus they're mostly just following orders. And while that's not a super great argument, it's functionally what's happening. And the arrangement of their abuses against the Palestinians and the creation of Hamas in order to generate um, a controlled opposition for the retaliations and scheduled exchanges in the wizard communist schedule of history generates these various narratives and compounding conflicts, which includes the function of Israel having an insurgent without a constitution to stop them, to order the attack against Israel's progress against Egypt in one of its former wars, and attacking that country. Attacking Egypt was undermined by the orders to attack Israeli soldiers by Israeli soldiers, which was ignored, and the person that ignored it was actively assassinated for this, as the undermining of the Israeli authority is the functional advantage, which requires the non existence of a constitution, which would have a superior court, which would be able to enforce against it, which would undermine their relation with the Confederates, which they are fully vulnerable to unless the Americans win the Civil War and restore David's title under that duel, which would generate the American military's destruction of um, threats to the Constitution, both foreign and domestic, creating the complete eradication of the threat against Israel being strong armed into these positions for the predetermined outcomes, and thus the various damages being understood are actively reinforcing on itself, and thus the spoiling of the nations of the world in order to validate their witchcraft and sorceries has been a primary resource, including the destruction and exploitation of vulnerable communities, which are actively promoted by the Democrats and others to remove the Second Amendment protections, preventing them from being able to defend themselves, making them vulnerable, making them extortable and abusable, so that the communists can rob the wealth of those that they find particularly interesting, and thus discard them as an inferior, illegitimate value, and thus maintain the active enforcement by the infection through the protocols of the learned elders of Zion, which is a function of the former Soviet Union's communism, amongst others, which generates these natural weaknesses um, inherent to the function of people not being able to solve those problems as they engage in various parasitical damages, and thus the engagement of their cult is a catastrophic threat to the country and its security, such as, but is not limited to, the fires in Maui, which were caused by the Confederates by the use of their systemic coercions and creation of undermining their protection mechanisms. They created the highest capability of the fires to happen, and then they started the fires for the extortion, and thus their various rackets actively maintain that the peoples that are deliberately supposed to be the authority are the enemy, and the civilians being the enemy means you have declared war on the Republic, which is a civilian government for, by, and of the civilian population. If the civilian population is your enemy, its government is your enemy, and its representation is your enemy, and thus David is your immortal adversary, and there is no alternative except for us killing each other. These banana republic functions engage in the persistent undermining of the possibility of peace and stability around the world, including but not limited to the function of the crime market and its wizard priests. The fascist position of public-private partnership actively exponentially increases the amount of corruption as the status quo culture inside the insurgency by the parasite, which generates the active laundering of the predetermined winners in the market, who are overseen by the legislators, who are exponentially given profits, such as trading advantages as insider traders for those developments, which they are paid off with as a function to reinforce their loyalty to the corporation which they have chosen, which allows them to oversee those that partially in favor of the promotion of their monopolizing against the others, which generates their cut, which is a fundamental aspect of the protocols of Learned Elders Zion in the mechanism of corrupting the system into self-destruction by its suicide bomber. Many of these cult practices for their corruption as their primary series of religious functions are based upon many intertwined religions into a coexist function, which assumes the position of the ancient Sumerians as the foundational god structure, are basically our ET aliens. Now, those engagements assume the very structure of the collapse of society and its arrangements, and thus it also includes the arrangements of the time travel mechanism, which they have actively infused into the function of their narratives, which express the position that David's character would be responsible for a world changing nuclear event, which, as national security, he would have control over, signifying the series of reactions to David's existence by the wizard communists would inevitably come into a non escapable strategy where it would become the only viable output. And this functional argument is basically just commit suicide or commit suicide. Now, if their options are commit suicide by the nuclear holocaust of winning, or commit suicide by the function of being genocided in the racist extermination mechanisms of Revelation's Antichrist by its artificial intelligence accelerated alien strategies, creates a series of complex battles, specifically of the mind, which they use in order to infect the function, which creates the obligation to engage in their own thinking in order to get a conversation that they actually competently are aware of as a reaction to what they actually think that they're doing, which requires the assumption that you accept their bases, which aren't entirely irrational or incompetent. Thus, if you have a function of interdimensional travel, you have the capacity to travel exponential distances, similar to the functions expressed in Star Trek, which were scientifically sound enough that it's viable. But this includes the function of beyond light speed travel, which breaks the components for time travel, which would facilitate its internal logic of being capable of conducting time travel explorers actively engaging in these manipulations, which includes the function of direct fraud by superior intellects, which actively fooling the less competent white supremacists, actively pursuing the occult knowledge and already functionally predetermined to accept those lies, such as the Nazis engaging in the archaeological adventures in order to find um, proof of ancient civilization superpowers. Uh, their ability to do that and subjugate themselves is the predetermined status quo mindset, and thus being preset to that arrangement, already being incompetent as the desirable mechanism of the white supremacists need people to be dumb enough in order to be used as the primary resource of collecting and distributing the information allows for the corruption to pollute preemptively all of the information for predetermined outcomes derived by their hate group objectives, and thus the function of these manipulations require the sustained understanding of those arrangements. Now, if the United States does not, in fact, maintain technologies derived by these assumptions in the estimate, then it becomes nullified upon the arrangement, which cannot functionally be acknowledged even at the point of discovery, which, if it had existed, would be a classified legitimate American secret, which would generate these positions that could not be expressed to the general public, and thus the narrative would have to functionally end despite the conversation continuing in another platform. But that being said, obedience is better than sacrifice. The ability to engage in time travel, nullifying the crimes of the white supremacists, is superior to them paying a financial compensation with the enjoyment of the injury, uh, including but not limited to the function of the possibility that they get away with their crimes and get to keep the profit. Uh, Escapades around the world conducting the tragedies of history. That being said, the intelligence community, having been infected by the white supremacist cult of the Confederacy, exponentially reproduce threats throughout the general public, directly and indirectly, including the creation of the phantom cells, which is the creation of subcults which generate their automated damages disconnected, allowing them to engage in their predetermined spells by low commitment investments, which generates the desired outcome by their druid controlled militia of the unprofessional forces which generate those positions, and their only real contingency for this or obligation to that is it being a low contact for the unprofessional force. And thus, the arrangement says that once they write the spell, they have to forfeit authority over the spell outside of their nullification contracts, which requires the use of the publishing of the Thieves' Canton according to the correct platforms, which would specifically be connected to the victims. And thus, the targets for the murder hobos would actively have to have representation on their public platforms, requiring them to become public figures ish, which is a nullified concept in the American law, which is actively being affected by the Confederacy, which is trying to strong arm these inconveniences, which generates legal byproducts and alternative functions. And these arrangements require the use of the disqualifier argument, and thus the Revenge X is, in this example, seeking the retaliation against David for not getting the contract in the estimate, would actively have to subordinate themselves to David's channels using the Thieves' Cant disillusionment um, statements while conducting the reports, which would actively be filtered into the general reports. And thus, the expression of just saying the report by itself doesn't nullify the phantom cell. The Thieves' Cant nullifies the phantom cell, but the Thieves' Cant cannot work without the rest of the report to buffer it, as disguising their language is the foundation of their ability to engage in the communication for the low commitment terrorist arrangements. The misinformation and disinformation actively cyclize is based upon the Phantom Cell's controlled narratives operations, which is a propaganda offset, which generates their capacity to engage with dark psyops, which actively reinforce the criminal narratives, such as, but is not limited to, their illegal wars in the Middle East, which were only reinforced by those activities, and thus the manufactured consent of the false narratives, where they actively engage in censorship and abuse of competing narratives, generates the outcomes predetermined and under the desired function through unitary executive theory, which ignores constitution and law of all forms in order to acquire the executive's kingly authority at the expense of the rule of law, which is systemically considered the adversary of those functional insurgents, which generates the predisposition towards the abuse and malice of the reinforcing structures of the competition supporting the rule of law and legitimate checks and balances restraining them, and thus the restraints being the adversary become attacked, and those who support it become the enemy and are systemically purged for the system to engage in its desired outcomes of lies by magic and fraud of all kinds.